Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. Thank you for your presence. We know that people are coming to join us. This morning, tonight we have a roundtable which is quite up to date. You know the topic, global security towards a new architecture, question mark, global security towards a new architecture. So this is, you know, in line with the new geopolitical context. This session will last less than an hour, but following the first discussion on stage, we'll open a Q&A session. Unfortunately, whoever is watching on a screen or on the internet cannot ask questions, but we'll ensure a couple of minutes at the end to establish a dialogue. We might not be able to take all the questions, you know. Sorry in advance, but you know, all you have to do is raise your hand. And the rule of the game, by the way, introduce yourself and you can establish a dialogue with the members of the panel. With no further ado, Laurence BOONE, who is the, hello for Laurence, at the other end of the rostrum, member of the Cercle des économistes, needs no introduction, and Laurence BOONE, former minister in charge of European affairs, among other prestigious titles in the public or private sector. So Laurence will introduce the topic. First, let me introduce the other speaker, Bastian GIEGERICH, Director General of the International Institute of Strategic Studies. In the 2010, you worked for the German Federal Ministry of Defense. JOKELA, Director of Research Program on Europe and Strategic Competition in the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, and your work dealt mainly with the sanction policies of the EU, Europeanization of foreign policy. So clearly at the heart of the topic. CREBO-REDIKER, thank you, Madam, for your presence. You're main principal member of the International Relationship based in New York. It's a think tank, US think tank, which examines the international relationship and the foreign affairs in the US. And you were also the advisor of Hillary Clinton advisor, and you directed the team in charge of the international economic policy of Joe Biden. Nicolas DUBOURG, to your left, Nicolas DUBOURG, founder and partner of ISALT, strategic investment in long-term actions, should be specified. It's a private company managing banking or, alternative energies, decarbonized industry innovation, you name it, they do it. And also, Thomas Irish Minister of European Affairs. So, and of course, Foreign Affairs and Defense. Sorry. Laurence, you got a couple of minutes to kick off the discussion. Then, of course, you will be able to get involved in the discussion. Thank you. Thank you, Emmanuel. Thank you all for your presence. A great pleasure to have you all. The Rencontre d'Aix makes it possible to see friends again every year, and they're not all in France, to have a very healthy discussion. 3 quick points. First, the world is more dangerous. I will explain a more authoritarian world, and it has impacts in terms of military expenditures, as we said, also in terms of the rising of what we call economic security. More dangerous world. The other day I was driving with my son. He said that in your days, in your young youth, there were wars. No, the Berlin Wall had just collapsed. The Soviet bloc was disappearing, and we thought that we'll be happy forever and ever in peace and democracy and joy. And now there are 3 major conflicts in the world, 3 which concerns us directly: Russia and Ukraine, and which ended the illusion that there could be a stable European order and that there could be cheap energy without any problems. The second one is Iran and Israel, which is of course causing a lot of problems in the oil region of the world, especially the Strait of Hormuz, and China, which in fact has the monopoly of the world production of semiconductors and chips, and could very well take over Taiwan, and this could be a problem. So today's world, we're no longer guided by business, but by geopolitics. And since all these, many of these powers, and we were discussing it, are all nuclear powers, they avoid hitting one another with their weapons because that would be nasty, but you do it in an indirect manner through barriers, tariffs, you know, and they filter direct investment in sensitive domains. Less than a third in the last decades of 80% of countries which do control, we're filtering the countries, and then the US tariff sanctions against Russia, but as well as the control of Chinese exportations and the exports. And just after when Trump announced the custom tariffs, well, China announced that he would put tariffs as well for rare earths and magnets, and they would do it only if the country that is buying it would explain the needs for that. So it is basically a sort of a commercial spying process. So conflicts, danger, more authoritarian world. We thought that the international trade would make it possible to have a converging governance system, but we have to, well, unfortunately that's not the case. Today there are less democracies than 30 years ago. So if we are, well, you know, 24 countries today out of 176 in the world are considered as a full democracy, which is not a lot. And authoritarian regimes such as Russia and Iran represent more than 37% of countries. And as per you, those who are shrinking. So in such condition, of course, the internal security is a bit, we can no longer follow the multilateral framework that existed, a well-organized relations and well-regulated dialogue. So we have to exchange on 3 points. I'll stop now. Yeah, if you could finish. First, more competition, less cooperation. We have to ensure secure energy supply. You have to secure your technology, your supply technology. We're running late behind the US, and we need to protect our market for investment to collect data or technological information. Second thing is that we'll have more military expenditures, and many of the participants will talk about it. I'll stop now. But as I said, I think we should not oppose defense and security, social security expenditures. And third thing, we have to recreate alliance by matching commercial and political systems, because one infrastructure project out of 2 in Africa is financed by China, built by a Chinese company, and 1 out of 3 is financed by a Chinese bank. Thank you for your introduction. Okay, you were perfect. Now, we expect the same from all the other speakers, by the way, to frame the discussion. So got each 3-4 minutes for introduction, then we'll have a discussion. Bastian, GIEGERICH, so I'm turning to you first. So let's focus on security and defense, and more lethal weapons in the hands of different players, if I could say so, or at least protagonists in the various conflicts today, which raises a lot of issues. So what lessons do you learn from these various situations in the world, conflicts?
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and speak a little bit about the defense and military matters that relate to what Laurence has introduced. So more weapons in more hands and more places. That means that that technology is proliferating, that global defense spending is reaching new heights. Just to give you a few numbers, Russia last year in purchasing power parity terms spent some $460 billion on defense, which last year was more than all of the European nations of NATO spent combined in that same year. So one needs to keep these relationships in perspective. In Europe, at the latest in 2026, we will push through the $500 billion threshold of defense spending, and NATO has, of course, just agreed that new 5% spending target to be reached by 2035, which would mean that in Europe we would spend well over $1 trillion on defense even now. So the point is that the world is rearming and governments are modernizing their armed forces. And in that context, and part of this trend is a renewed interest or a strengthened interest in novel and emerging technologies to increase the effectiveness but also the efficiency of armed forces. Artificial intelligence has been mentioned a couple of times today. Unmanned systems have been mentioned a couple of times, and these are certainly at the forefront of the imagination for the moment. And at the moment, it's quite interesting that about 80% of the casualties that are inflicted upon the Russian armed forces in their war of aggression against Ukraine actually stem from unmanned systems at the moment. NATO would fight very differently. Ukraine fights this way because it has no other choice but to fight this way. But it's certainly a good idea for NATO to try and integrate those systems, and the EU, of course, as well, and those technologies at pace and at scale. And what we see when we look at armed conflict at the moment is that the economy of war has changed. We are seeing people using cheap modes of attack, which one needs to defend against with sophisticated and expensive assets, and that in the long run is unsustainable. So I would say Europeans need to invest in the ability to create affordable mass with technology that is rapidly fielded and can be scaled at pace. And those platforms will be important for the future of warfare. And that is also an area where we have very high dependency on the United States at the moment. And I would just, for my introduction, just close on that point because the US administration has stated very clearly that it does not want dependent allies, it wants empowered allies. So I think it is actually, we should spend a little bit less time worrying about the US and focusing a little bit more time on our own choices to achieve higher degrees of autonomy in that field. So because the threat to Europe is up, the US commitment is down, we should think about what dependencies we are still comfortable with and that are still acceptable, and we should talk amongst ourselves as Europeans what we can do to reduce the others. And I'll close here for now.
Merci, merci beaucoup, Bastian.
Thank you, Bastian. I'm turning now to Juha, JOKELA. So we're talking from competition to rivalry, strategic rivalry. Now, if we look at the long-term impact, don't you think it is also the evolution of the economic power that will be induced by this restructuration, reshuffling defense, security, financial means? We saw that with the demands from the US president on the contribution of each country to NATO. They saw the famous 5% of the GDP, so the economy is underlying there.
Thank you very much, moderator, and also coordinator. It's a great pleasure to be here in southern France. Greetings also from Helsinki, which is a bit cooler place to be at this time of year than here, but I'll do my best and try to keep my mind focused. Economy, of course, is very, very important, I think, and this is something what comes to the whole question of the world where we witness more strategic competition among the great powers, not only the great powers, also the mid-sized powers, regional powers, they're all engaging in this kind of more competitive mindset. And if we try to connect that to the topic of this session towards new security architecture, or maybe perhaps indeed a lack of it, I think this really reflects the longer-term trends. Developments in economic, military, as well as ideational power. I think we've heard here in the forum yesterday and today in many of the sessions about how contested the global multilateral order is and the global architecture. There's been a lot of sessions here focusing on economic governance institutions as well as health questions, and of course climate governance is also the kind of the field where the competition is seen. But what I think is new at the moment and has happened during the past years and also during the early months of this year is that this contestation now extends beyond questions of representation and power or the liberal Western norms. This contestation and competition has spilled over to the very core of the international security order or the global architecture, that is to the core principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, as well as use of non-force. So in terms of global security architecture, and despite its all shortcomings, which are well documented, these norms have formed a kind of a bedrock of the post-war global security order. They are the norms that are enshrined in the UN Charter. And now when we have the Russia's aggression, we have China's assertiveness, and importantly also the US policies and posture under President Donald Trump's second administration, these kind of reflects in many ways a kind of a recourse to hierarchical power relations where dominant actors seek to enforce spheres of influence and constrain weaker states through coercion economically and militarily. And in this context, we see very limited moves towards a kind of a motivation or emphasis to create a new order or reform the old one. And I think this is the kind of the talking point of today's discussion and also this forum more general. Thank you, I stop here.
Merci à vous, merci JOKELA. Alors, Madame Heidi CREBO-REDIKER, nous parlons ici.
This is Heidi CREBO-REDIKER. We talk about the necessary construction and design of a new global security architecture, but also economic architecture, digital, because we know that cyber attacks are damaging, technological spying. So the G7 worked on these points, especially in view of the French presidency, because France will be running the G7 for a while. So how do you see the world? How do you see this future, madam?
So thank you for the invitation to come and speak here today. And yes, I think that I'd like to call the attention to economic security and to what we can do based on traditional G7 architecture and build on some of the work that's already been done in a way that is actually consistent with what I believe the Trump administration would like to do moving forward. And given France is going to chair the presidency of the G7, I would encourage that we build on the work that was done in Japan, where they focused very much on resilience and shared resilience and cooperation, particularly to counter economic coercion, to counter overcapacity and dumping, particularly from China, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure that underpin our critical infrastructure, and technology leakage, and the fact that we have certain amounts of very high level of technology that we do still have that have dual uses that we need to actually cooperate in protecting. So the first thing, the economic resilience that Japan spoke to, we need to have something that goes beyond the rhetoric to actually meet this moment right now. It needs to be coherent, it needs to be effective. Multilateralism is under strain. President Trump has lost the trust of a lot of his trusted partners. And we are in a time where the divisions between economic, national security, technology, has really dissolved. So we are at a very, very different place where capital flows and investment are not just engines of growth, they're also levers of strategic interference and geopolitical vulnerability. So it's been driving a lot of economic statecraft. I believe that that Japan and EU have both adopted their own internal strategic plans for economic security and protecting their own, but they cannot do it alone. It is not possible. So where do you start? I think the non-market threats that come from China that have been alluded to are all of our problem. You have, across supply chains, you have unprecedented scale that has been driving exports of China and is flooding the markets and really crushing a lot of our industries all over the world. It's not just a developed country issue, it's a developing country issue. And flooding of markets will actually will be a shared challenge that we should tackle together. The second thing is that when we have those individual trade tariff reactions, the exports then ricochet. They're hitting the European Union right now. EVs are coming out of China, particularly targeting Germany. I was about to buy some brandy from France for all my friends until I read today that China is actually not going to impose the tariffs that it was intending to. And again, on critical infrastructure, the United States discovered that there is lurking cyber intrusions on the entirety of United States infrastructure. I'm talking the grid, I'm talking our pipelines, our water, our sewage systems, our hospitals, our telecommunications, you name it, it's there. It's why we're replacing a lot of the cranes in the ship-to-shore cranes in our ports, because we are 80% plus dependent on Chinese cranes. And we found that there are cyber risks that are embedded and malware embedded in the software updates.
Merci. On va y revenir. On va y revenir.
We'll get back to that. We'll get back to this. Thank you, madam. So, Nicolas Dubourg. So, I'm turning to the investor now. You're going to tell us the vision of a long-term investor on the funding of defense, autonomy, homeland security, social security, with the duality. Therefore, we can redeploy, redevelop our industry, especially the defense industry. So it's not destruction, creative destruction, but it's purely investment.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much for giving me the floor. I want to talk about the return of this duality and how it can help us to develop industry through technology and help us in terms of our sovereignty and strategic autonomy. I want to talk about three very simple observations. The first is that the investment needs in the defence sector are very significant. I think we've underestimated them when we think about the scale of the needs. First of all, we need to develop our defence industries very rapidly. We need to increase production capacity. The order book is twice or three times as big as what it was a few years ago. Inventories are very low. When you look back 30 years ago to the end of the Cold War, we're sometimes 80%, 90% lower in terms of inventory. So to ramp up production rates will require a lot of capital investment. Second point, there's new technology that needs to be incorporated. We have no choice about that. Drones, jamming technologies are vital on the battlefield. These are real key technological issues that we need to invest in. And the third point, which hasn't yet been fully covered, but we couldn't ignore, is future threats. High altitude, the weaponization of space, quantum technologies, which has been mentioned. These are issues that we need to think about and not get left behind on. Second observation is that private investment needs to play a role. The states and national governments can't do everything. It's a quite an attractive investment proposition because it's growing. As long as you take into account a certain number of aspects, it's a very specific segment to invest in. Sovereignty is a key issue. It's a very highly structured market with major commissioning bodies which issue very big orders and roll them out to a very structured value chain. Over time, for ESG reasons, there's been perhaps too little discussion between investors, private companies and governments on these issues. So more discussion and dialogue is necessary. We need to work on all of these things in order to release private investment in this sector. My third point is about this duality. We knew this dual approach in the 1960s, and it enabled France to build three key sectors: nuclear, space and military. And the big French corporations that have benefited from investment in that era are now the strongest companies in France today. And these dual industries brought major innovation and hardware into consumers' pockets. There's technology that's used as well in planes and nuclear power plants and satellites. So this is not a back to the future thing, it's a strategic repositioning in favour of our strategic autonomy. Thank you, Nicolas. We're going to talk a bit more about strategic autonomy in the sectors that are part of this. Thomas Byrne, I'm going to turn to you. You're Irish Minister of State for European Affairs and Defence, as you reminded me. I just want to go back to this issue of neutrality, because Ireland is a neutral country. I don't know if we could talk about perfect neutrality, but a very clear neutral stance. But this issue of neutrality raises questions because the world defence industry is getting strengthened. Ireland needs to make an effort in this area. What's your analysis of this?
Absolutely, and je suis ravi d'être ici aujourd'hui.
I'm delighted to be here with you today, and particularly with Laurence. Laurence was my counterpart as minister, I think, in 2022.
Is a neutral country, but our neutrality really, in this day and age, is defined by our non-membership of NATO. That is essentially what our neutrality means, and we're very much focused on making sure our country is secure and working with European partners to make sure that European security is allowed to develop. I would say that our policy is basically one of principles-based pragmatism. And we've actually seen in Ireland since 2022 a 22% increase in defence spending. So we're not immune from the challenges, and we know that we're coming from a low base in terms of defence spending, and we know we have to do more, and we are doing more. And in fact, only last week, we announced a new contract for the provision of sonar at sea, and that's been done with Thales, obviously a French company. But we are without some of the basics that a modern military needs. Sonar, radar. There's currently a contract for radar going through the procurement processes at the moment. So we know we're coming from a low base, but we have committed to making sure that we have a military that is capable. Now, in terms of what's happening at European level, we're very, very clear that we want to be a constructive partner. We want to make sure that European countries can do, I mean, defence is a national capability fundamentally, but there is a requirement for more and more European cooperations, and we will not stand in the way of that. And in fact, we will have the presidency of the Council of the European Union next year, and very much a secure Europe will be a focus of that. And our defence spending is projected to rise in the next couple of years even more significantly. But one of the challenges that's been mentioned by Nicolas in terms of production and procurement, they are challenges. Even if we had unlimited money today, we would not be able to spend it immediately. But we have a programme there to make sure that we can bring our military up to an acceptable standard and to work with our European colleagues in the spheres that we do, and to cooperate and to have interoperability as well, which is very, very important for all of us.
Bon, alors on va voir justement comment.
So let's think about how all of that can be worked out in practice. Bastian, GIEGERICH, I'm going to turn back to you. Russia is talked about as weakened by the war in Ukraine. Is it still a threat for Europe today? Is Russia still a threat? Many people are asking the question. It's perhaps a controversial question.
It's a very clear yes. And in the hybrid field, which was mentioned, Russia is already at war with Europe. That's very clear. And it also perceives itself to be at war with Europe in that field. I think we should talk perhaps about raising a bit more awareness about those vulnerabilities, those threats, those challenges that affect our critical national infrastructure, that affect our society, that affect the private sector in many different ways. But I would also say militarily, it also still is a threat. Russia is currently producing more equipment than it uses in its war effort in Ukraine. It is growing its force structure in terms of personnel. And the ISS assessment at the moment is at least that were the war in Ukraine to stop, Russia would need about 2 years to reconstitute its armed forces, and maybe 5 to 7 years to actually fill a larger force structure than it had before. So that capacity is still there. There are parts of the Russian armed forces that are actually not affected or have not suffered much from the war. So I would answer yes, definitely already in the hybrid field, but potentially also very soon also in the military field.
Heidi, CREBO-REDIKER.
Heidi, CREBO-REDIKER, listening to what the previous speaker has just said, what would you say the role of the G7, particularly in the context of the Donald Trump presidency and the world geopolitical context?
Question, but I think one very important issue that I have not heard come up so much today on defense is that you have the greatest innovation coming out of Ukraine on the battlefield in autonomy, in AI, in electronic warfare, counter-electronic warfare. You have the lowest cost production coming out of Ukraine right now. You have the defense industrial base there that provided 13% of the Soviet Union's significant rocket and tank capacity. And if you are envisioning a future where Ukraine is going to be part of the European Union, not integrating them and funding their defense industrial base right now so that they can help protect the future of Europe is folly. And I would encourage you to actually look at the innovation that's being created in Europe, in Ukraine, for them to defend their lives, because it is exactly what Europe needs. It's low cost, it's highly innovative. You have some of the best technologists in the world that are there, and they really want to be part of Europe, so use that.
Alors Laurence BOONE, tu souhaitais réagir?
Laurence BOONE, did you want to respond? Yes, thank you very much, Emmanuel. I could not agree more with what Heidi has just said. When you look at what Ukraine is doing and its fighting capabilities, it's better to have them on our side than against us. So I also wanted to respond to what Bastian was saying. It's difficult to convince our citizens that Russia is a genuine threat because Russia thought it would gobble up Ukraine in 3 weeks, and it's only taken 20% of its territory in 3 years. So saying that we need to build our defense industries up, as Juha and Nicolas were saying, is a difficult argument to make. It's one of the many discussions we had with Thomas when we were ministers together. So I'll let him talk about this. So Thomas, perhaps first. Thomas, would you like to say something about what was just been said by Laurence and Heidi?
And merci beaucoup, Laurence.
Thank you very much, Laurence.
Heidi said, I think we need to protect Ukraine's future in Europe and in the European Union. Geographically, of course, Ukraine is in Europe, but it needs to be politically and democratically in the European Union. And for the reason that Laurence just briefly alluded to, it is absolutely essential for us, for our security as well, to make sure that Ukraine's European future and its democratic path are absolutely protected. And that requires, obviously, they are fighting on the battlefield and defending themselves to extraordinary ability. But we must, on this side, we must protect their future as members of the European Union and make that happen. For so many reasons, moral, democratic, but also security reasons as well.
Bastian, vous souhaitiez réagir?
Yeah, I just wanted to react to one or two of the things that have been mentioned. And I think in terms of Ukraine's innovation potential, I think that's absolutely true. The pace is, you know, we used to think about major upgrades to defense capabilities in terms of like 6 years or something. And then people turned around, technologists turned around and said, okay, we need to bring that down to 6 months. The Ukrainians then started bringing it down to 6 weeks, and now they're iterating in 10 days, sometimes less than that, sometimes on a daily basis. So that is a pace that our ecosystem currently cannot match, and we need to think about how to do that. I would say though, it is not that hard to convince the population of the need to invest in defense. I think we have moved on, and I wish that sometimes politicians would have a little bit more trust in their electorate and explain a little bit more about what the threat is and why it is important to meet it. And I think if we find, to Nicolas' point, if we find a new balance between public and private investment to fund that innovation drive and that future capability, I think we're really onto something, and we're onto something that also, just from an economic point of view, creates value for the economy as a whole, not just for defense capability.
JOKELA, vous souhaitiez réagir également?
Yes, very briefly. I think the real challenge, of course, is the kind of the very rapidly changing environment within which these developments take place. But if we look a little bit more longer term, so of course there are now all these new plans in the table, and the Commission proposal of REARM Europe, and the kind of the 150 billion safe mechanism which is built in there, that has explicitly a kind of aspiration to engage Ukraine in the joint defense projects. And of course, a lot is happening now in Europe, and then among the member states as well. There are all type of potential minilateral arrangements as well, different kind of ways to fund defense investments. But then if we look at or we try to zoom out from Europe, I think this also means in a way that the Europe is very focused on Europe and Ukraine. And then the whole question whether European Union can emerge, or Europe, as a kind of a defender of the norms and rules-based order and system, also in the field of security, when thinking about potential security and defense partnerships. So I think there is less political energy and possibilities to focus on that agenda at the moment, when the focus is very much here in Europe.
Alors, il y a également des questions de défense.
There are also questions of defense related to minerals and mineral ores. So, to what extent are mineral ores of vital importance in the current geopolitical context? We're not talking just about industrial economics. I know with the minerals we could create chips for industry, but minerals are vital today, are they not? Heidi.
And there, the G7 has actually put something forward in Canada recently, where there's the Critical Minerals Action Plan, because we are all in the same boat when it comes to the coercion and the lack of investment we've all collectively not made in our own development of critical minerals and the development of the refining capacity, especially in rare earths, especially in heavy rare earths, the ones that are being choked off by China right now through their new export regime. So I think that there are, it's not just in chips, it's also in cars, it's in a lot of different parts of industries that we need magnets. It's also very much involved in the defense industry, no more so than in the United States.
Oui, on parle de souveraineté, de toute façon, le mot est vraiment...
Yes, we're talking about sovereignty. It's a really key word at the moment. Nicolas, DUBOURG, we've been talking about defense, economics and minerals, and you were talking about duality. Can you give any more examples than what's already been mentioned? Yes, we can talk about space. Space is a dual domain by nature, because space is used for communications. If you watch TV, you sometimes might be watching via satellites. A lot of our communications use satellite technology, but a lot of satellite technology is also used for military purposes, for observing and reconnoitering what is going on around the planet. These technologies are used for climate change research, so these are very dual technologies. And this is a good thing, because depending on the economic cycle, you can use these technologies in different ways at different times and move through these different cycles. There's been a strong awakening in Europe, which the IRIS project of the European Union sort of anticipated. It was going to come to light in 2030. It's a massive investment project, public-private investment, which is going to set up a low orbit constellation to compete with Starlink. That's the idea very clearly, and it's really important in this context to have a European tool that would enable us to meet military and civilian needs and ensure that we're not fully dependent on Starlink. Let me just tell you one thing about Elon Musk's Starlink. The company does not guarantee the security of its users, and it doesn't provide any service guarantee. It can switch the service off overnight, so if you need to use it for military purposes and it's not working, or if you want to use it for civilian or security purposes, I don't think that will be appropriate. So Europe's going to need to invest. France is leading the way in this area with a major economic ecosystem in this area. So I think it's really important to think in the European terms about this issue. I'm going to hand back over to JOKELA to talk about this and to talk about European standards. You were mentioning them earlier. Do you think Europe can promote and defend the rules-based order this order is challenged. Even in France, on a political level, in the National Assembly, we're seeing the rules-based international order being challenged. Can we build reliable rules on a European level?
Of course, a key question for Europe and the European Union, and I think there is obviously a kind of a very traditional way of approaching it. Either the glass is half full or it's half empty. And if we want to see it half full, I think we can see in this kind of a new context of strategic competition and rivalry that there is a number of countries, there is private industry as well, which is holding up to the rules-based order, and basically the Europe has possibility to build these partnerships with the Western countries and the United States, or without it as well, if need be. But then if we look at the other side of the coin and how the glass is half empty, I think I already alluded to that. Europe, for the past 15 years, has been struggling with these existential internal crises, which often comes from external environment, starting from the euro crisis, then migration crisis and so forth. And I think this has kind of recentered the focus of so-called global Europe back to Europe. And that's why there are, I'd say, difficulties to finding a kind of political ethos to build up a strategy and then also the action. And then, of course, Europe has to look its own foreign policy as well. And of course, we are faced with all the time throughout the world with the accusations of double standards. And that's, of course, a key issue when one wants to uphold the norms, especially the core norms, if you cannot answer very eloquently to these accusations.
Alors, je ne vais pas donner la parole à la défense.
I'm not going to give the floor to the defence, but nonetheless, Thomas BYRNE, you're not as neutral as all that. You wanted to jump into this debate. I think you wanted to respond to Juha, did you?
Based international order, like, I mean, certainly from our point of view, from Ireland's point of view, this has always been crucial to where we see ourselves as a country. And I think we need to keep explaining it to our people that the rules-based international order that we all comply with, the rule of law within our own countries, has been really critical to our economic success and certainly in Ireland, our economic progress. And I think that's the same throughout the European Union, and we need to keep explaining this. Now, there are challenges with it. For example, Irish peacekeepers have served for decades with UN missions, and including with French soldiers as well, and given great example and enhanced our reputation. But we have a current requirement that the UN Security Council authorises the Irish presence abroad in peacekeeping missions. And that's really challenging at the moment because Russia, of course, has a veto on the Security Council. So does China, so does France. France has never been a problem. But we're now removing that requirement to have a UN Security Council mandate. That is a challenge arising from the world order, getting into difficulties. But it's also a signal that we want to do more on our own, in accordance with international law, in accordance with basic principles, as I said, of peace and protecting ourselves, protecting our democracies. But this is a challenge that we all face at the moment.
Toute dernière question avant de donner la parole à la salle.
Final question before I hand hand over to the floor for some questions. But very quickly, we've got an isolationist president in the White House. Can multilateralism be a solution to the current issues that you've mentioned? Heidi, perhaps if you can answer this.
Essential. And I think that this is a perfect opportunity for Europe to look, as we've all talked about today, inward. Inward, but in a way that's actually not going to be to fragmentation and to actually take the hard decisions that everyone here talks about and nobody knows if you're actually going to follow through with. So absolutely, move forward in trade. Join the CPTPP in Asia, follow the UK's lead. Conclude the agreement with Mercosur, conclude the trade agreement with India. Go and create a better hedge. Build a better hedge for yourself, both by investing in Europe, but also with other international partners who are very much aligned with you. The choice is not binary between the US and China. There's a whole rest of the world out there that has a combined GDP that you can be incredibly powerful with if you actually just go there.
Alors on va voir comment la France justement qui s'apprête à prendre la présidence.
So we'll see how France, which is going to chair the G7, might be able to offer solutions. I promised that you'd have the floor. We've got about 5 minutes left for questions, so I'm going to ask you to ask very brief questions. We've got a very interesting panel that you won't necessarily find at other opportunities. I'm going to ask you to raise your hands if you want to ask a question. We'll bring you a microphone. Introduce yourself and then ask a question. Don't tell a story. I'm going to be very strict about that so we can have as much discussion as possible. Would anyone like to ask a question? If you haven't got any question, I've got loads of other ones, but I wanted to hand over to you. That's what the Rencontres ENEX are all about. Every year we have the opportunity to discuss things. The gentleman at the front, let's bring you a microphone. I might be able to give you mine. That might be the easiest thing. Yes, over to you. Thank you very much. My name is Philippe Herrera from the Safran Group. I've got a question for Heidi.
The challenges we face coming from China. During the French presidency of the European Union, we developed in particular the anti-coercion instrument, which allowed us to protect, if it was activated, the EU and our EU partners against Chinese coercion, and this was triggered by pressure on Lithuania. Today, the debate in Brussels is whether we trigger the anti-coercion instrument against the United States in the context of the tariff wars. This is a debate we can have within the EU, regardless of where we arrive. It is not a debate we will be able to have, obviously, within the G7. So my question is, the anti-coercion instruments you mentioned and the economic security instruments you mentioned, can we and should we think about them in the G7? Because even if there is a life after Trump, the US will not be seen in the same way as before.
So I absolutely take your point.
Le point que vous soulevez est excellent. Il faut de la confiance de la part des partenaires de confiance pour que la sécurité économique fonctionne. J'ai une lueur d'espoir que je perçois à partir de la réunion au Canada. C'est la participation des États-Unis en ce qui concerne l'accord sur les minéraux critiques. On parle des pratiques de soutien au secteur privé, la manière de régler les problèmes en ce qui concerne les minéraux critiques. Les mesures anti-coercition de l'Union européenne, je n'ai pas de conseils à vous donner à ce sujet-là, mais je dirais que le monde d'aujourd'hui est un monde qui a changé. Une expérience de très grande échelle est menée aux États-Unis. On verra ce que ça donnera en termes de commerce international, en termes de sécurité économique et de sécurité nationale. Je pense que c'est un moment pour que l'Europe s'investisse en elle-même et qu'elle recherche de nouveaux partenaires. Et on peut pour cela passer par le G7.
In the US, and President Trump is there at the moment, the Democrats, I'm sure, will come back at some point. The dependencies that both sides have on each other are very, very real. So there are French companies providing parts that are essential for American cars. The American auto supply chain would collapse without some certain French companies. There are pharmaceutical companies in Ireland that are essential for the European market as well as for the American market. And those dependencies are very, very real. The American pharma product chain could not survive without pharma here, and I think the car chain could not survive as well. So we've got those realities are always there, and I think will certainly be to the fore of the minds of those on both sides that are discussing trade between the EU and US as we speak at the moment.
Avant de donner la parole à Laurence Boone pour la...
Before I hand over to Laurence Boone to wrap up this debate, I just want to turn back to you, Nicolas DUBOURG, one last time to talk about the issue of investment. That's your area of expertise, that's your DNA. So with respect to the investments that we've talked about, what are the key conditions required, the key prerequisites in order to generate investment in the defence sector, to generate success? I know that some political parties oppose this, parties of the far left generally, who have a voice in the national debate. How can we encourage investment in national defence and say it's necessary, it's not destructive at all?
Enfin, la première, je pense qu'il faut qu'il y ait une adhésion.
There are a lot of conditions. First of all, countries and citizens need to buy into these projects. So is it about having a pedagogical approach? Yes, pedagogy is what I'm talking about. It's a way of generating investment in useful financial products. It's a highly structured and highly planned market. The defence industry has long-term contracts. So as a financial stakeholder, it's very important to have a long-term visibility. It's important to understand the programs that we're investing in. The field of investment is very broad. It can be extremely industrial. There's a manufacturing industry. There's investment in tech. There's new technology that requires investment, and that's a more risky investment. We can talk about cybersecurity, AI. It's a very broad investment field. From our point of view, it's a very interesting market. We're not trying to be opportunistic, but I think it is an attractive and interesting market. But there's some key conditions, fundamental conditions. First of all, when you're an investor, you need to be ready to sell an asset at the right time. So selling a defense-related asset does have a certain number of constraints attached to it. There are some areas of business which are very perspective and particular, and which may end up evolving. So you need to know the rules in the sector. The industry is working hard. We need to create a financial ecosystem, and ideally on a European level, in order to boost investment. Thank you very much to all of you. Laurence, I'm going to hand over to you to wrap up. I think instead of concluding, you need to open the discussion further, because there's a lot more to be done. Thank you very much to all of you. It's been very interesting. I think there's been a very clear point, a point that we're all clear about, is about the threat from Russia and the need for us to rearm. I think that the discussion has focused quite a bit on that. And for Russia, we know that the threat is concrete. We have finance, we have an industry, and we've almost got orders coming through the pipeline. So I think we're fairly clear about what we want: drones, space technology, quantum technologies, and AI. We need to make progress in this field. Where we're a bit less clear, and I think Heidi pointed this out, is about the threat from China. China controls a lot of the raw materials and components that come into the things we've discussed, whether it's energy provision, defense-related hardware, electronic chips, and the relations with the US are a bit unclear at the moment, so it's difficult to find alignment within the G7 in order to place sector-specific agreements between different countries. So on this issue, the USA has placed a contract with India for chips for cars and washing machines and things like that, because the Indians know how to do that. It's not being made in Taipei, and it's helping the USA move away from a dependency on Taiwan and Taipei. The concrete question that Heidi asked is whether we in Europe are ready to do the same thing. I think we're not clear about that, because when the Americans vote through an Inflation Reduction Act, or when they threaten us with tariffs, there's always a bit of reticence. Thank you very much. We can give a round of applause to all our panelists. Thank you very much. Thank you to all of you. Thank you everyone who's been here. We're coming to the end of the day, but there are some more sessions tomorrow, and I'll say goodbye to those who are watching us behind their screens at home. This has been the 25th Rencontre in Aix-en-Provence. We're going on one more session this evening and again tomorrow. Thank you very much.